I promise I don't normally take this much time to be sappy in my videos, but I just wanted to start off this one here with a huge note of gratitude to the Path of Exile community, who has been more than open and welcoming, as well as just leaving a huge amount of support, guidance, great ideas, and just hanging out with me in chat as I've been playing through the campaign on my first ever character. Thank you all so much. You've really made my first step into the community an incredibly welcoming one. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm also happy to report that the Infernalist Witch Minion build that I shared earlier is absolutely trouncing not only the Cruel campaign, but all the way into the Endgame. I'm happy to report that I've already been able to clear tier 10 maps on what I would argue is near garbage tier gear as far as I could tell based off of what my chat community has been telling me. And I wanted to give you all not only an update to how the build is functioning, the new strategies that I've found and developed to be able to push it even further, and just give you my insight into how I have been building it myself. And I'm also happy to report that I went and put it all into a planner for you. I'm going to go ahead and include a link to the planner down below just in case you prefer that form of learning, but I've included all of the skill gems, the support gems, the entirety of my passive tree that I've built out. This is where I'm hoping to get to. It's not where I'm at yet. I'm not max level. And while I haven't filled out every single piece of gear, these are basically the most important pieces of gear with the stats that I think are the most important to focus on. Everything else will just be survivability or like maximum life, mana, energy shield, that type of stuff. And I also went and included some notes from me actually playing through the Cruel campaign to give you an idea of when I was actually able to find the different skill gems and the different spirit gems, to give you a better understanding of when you should be able to come across these yourself. Again, I'll include a link to that down below so you can go ahead and take a look at it at your leisure, so you don't have to listen to me yap if that's not the best way for you to learn. But I'm actually incredibly happy with this build, how it's functioning, and how I feel like I have a lot of wiggle room, not only for customization, but also just the ability to continue to output damage. But the thing that I'm most happy about is how easy it made it for people to be able to clear through the Cruel campaign, especially on some of those bosses that I've been hearing people struggle with. Like, let's go ahead and check out these two clips where I just one-shot these bosses, not knowing that the majority of people apparently are not doing this right now. Oh, this lady is gonna hurt my feelings. Oh. Unique item. Ow. All right. Phase 1, Dr. Robotnik dead. Wait, isn't he? Is he not dead? Hello? Dr. Robotnik? I'm not doing damage to him, so... he's just going through phases, I guess? Alright.
I must save my people.
I must save my people.
It happens! It cannot be stopped!
No, I will succeed.
Oh! Preparing for you for years.
Let's see you survive this.
Now!
I cannot let my efforts be in vain. Nothing will stand in my way.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into a map right now because I'd like to give you just a quick sneak peek of what the gameplay is going to look like, so you get a better idea of how we're kind of weaving all this together and why I've made the choices that I have. With the biggest departure from my previous build guide being the removal of Fireball as a skill and the inclusion of Spark. And I think that there's something here that's really important to highlight. So again, let's go ahead and hop into a random map here just so you can get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. For people who might be brand new to the build, the general concept here is that we are an arsonist minion build. We're going to be relying on raging spirits as one of our biggest tools for being able to apply damage, and then basically synergizing as often as we can not only with the fire damage motif here, but as well as just the general things that would increase the damage of all of our minions. So our arsonists are going to throw fire bombs. The fire bombs are obviously going to do elemental fire damage, but in addition to that, you can also target the raging spirits here with your arsonist ability to be able to explode them once they get down to a certain amount of maximum life. The rotation is fairly simple. We want to summon raging spirits whenever possible. Our arsonists are going to throw projectiles. Those projectiles are going to pick up additional fire damage from the flame wall that's summoning the spirits to start. So the spirits come out, they automatically ignite and do a megaton of damage. They're going to be applying exposure, which is a debuff, which will increase the amount of fire damage that my minions are going to deal. The monster being entrapped inside of a flame wall makes all of our arsonists' missiles or projectiles that they fire out do more damage since they pick up that fire damage. And then basically we just want to make these monsters as susceptible to fire damage as possible. Since we are a minion build, we get to get the huge amount of additional bonus damage using something like an offering. The offering is going to not only increase just damage in general from our minions within range, but it's also going to gain them rage. Rage is basically just another little buff that they'll gain that will further increase their damage. We also have our Hellhound out. Our Hellhound is also a really great Ignite tool. When our Hellhound properly applies Ignite to a target and they die, they will have a chance to explode to further increase the amount of AoE damage that we're able to output. And then we're going to use Flammability, which is a curse, which will further increase the amount of fire damage that our targets take. And since all these things are modifying either our minions directly or the monsters that we're dealing damage to, all of it will work together. A quick note to understand about minion builds is that unless a stat very specifically says it works for your minion, or it modifies the target that's being attacked, it generally won't work. So increasing your elemental damage won't make your minions do more damage. And then this is where we're using Spark. Now, Spark might seem like a weird inclusion on this very fire damage focused setup. But the great part about Spark, and I'm just going to highlight it here by casting it, is that realistically it just spawns a megaton of projectiles. And when those projectiles pass through your flame wall, they all pick up the fire damage from the flame wall as well. In addition to that, they generally spread out very easily, meaning that you're able to apply damage over a wide area. You have very good spread. And the other great part is that they can all hit the same target. So once you walk up smooth to some kind of tanky elite or a boss, you're actually able to basically just shotgun all of them into it. And you'll notice that your DPS meter against the boss up in the top right, if you've never seen it, will quickly go into gold, which I think is it maxing out at its like highest potential DPS, as far as I can tell, is what that generally represents. But this is the overall concept of the build. But if you are coming from my previous video, you'll notice that I'm no longer using this skill, Fireball. And it wasn't immediately obvious why Fireball was becoming a net negative for the build right away. It seems like it works with everything very well. Fireball is going to do big damage. We like big damage. Fireball is also going to fire off a projectile, so it works with Flame Wall. Seems good. On top of that, Raging Spirit can actually be spawned from projectiles from fire skills. So maybe let's say you haven't cast Flame Wall in a little bit. You would instead cast Fireball. Fireball will spawn your Raging Spirits for you. All of this seems great. So what was the problem? Well, it's actually that last little bit right there that ended up being the issue. It spawns the Raging Spirits whenever you cast Fireball. So whereas you would normally want your Raging Spirits to be localized around your Flame Wall because you're casting Flame Wall around the target that you want to fight, by casting Fireball in addition to this, it would spawn the Raging Spirits at the end of the projectile's distance. But not only that, Fireball has a secondary effect where after it hits, it spawns more projectiles, which then fly out. And if I had a wall to hit, I'd actually be able to show you this. There we go. So the initial projectile will fly out. The secondary projectiles will then fly typically very far away from any targets. And at the end of those projectiles, it will spawn Raging Spirits. Now, why is this a problem? You can only ever have 10 Raging Spirits up at a time. So you'll notice that as I'm casting this here, it is respawning Raging Spirits, which are taking away from the ones localized around the target and instead spreading them around further away. And when you're fighting at max range against a boss, I noticed that especially in an arena, the Raging Spirits would basically all be localized to the edge of the arena where these projectiles are hitting their terminus, and are no longer centralized around the boss. So you would basically have these little lulls in the combat where I would do Flame Wall, the Raging Spirits would be there and fighting. I would then cast my Fireball a couple times, which would replace all of the localized ones to these ones out on the outskirts of the combat area. Whereas Spark, which is a lightning projectile, will still gain the benefits of, again, passing through the flame wall. Also, it just looks insanely cool. Like, this isn't typically something that I necessarily worry about in a video game like this, but you have to admit, the flaming sparks just absolutely ricocheting across the entirety of an arena is one of the cooler looking effects. But back to the brass tacks, Spark doesn't count as a fire projectile for the purposes of Raging Spirit. It won't respawn them, meaning it won't diffuse them throughout the combat area, and will keep them all localized on top of where you spawn them with Flame Wall. I also want to give you a much better understanding of the individual minions that we're using, why we're using them, and the different use cases of them, because I think that in a minion build, that's obviously the most important thing. But before we get to that, I'd actually like to just take a quick jaunt over to our sponsor, Factor. Factor is a fully prepared meal kit delivery system that answers the question that I think myself and a lot of millennials at this time with jobs, kids, multiple things on their plates, no pun intended there, but basically the idea of, oh geez, it's dinner time, I haven't gone shopping, I don't have time to make something, and I don't just want to keep eating garbage every night. What am I going to do? With a truly boggling amount of options available across a multitude spectrum of various dietary restrictions and concerns, Factor answers that incredibly easily and efficiently without you wasting money by continuously buying those ingredients and failing to cook those meals that you keep saying you're gonna do, but you realize you just don't have the time or energy. And Factor makes it easy for you to make sure that you're still getting all the things that your body needs to be a fully functioning adult. You can use the code currently across the screen here or use the link down in the description below to get 50% off of your first box, as well as free delivery anywhere in the United States. If you're interested in checking out Factor for yourself, again, to get 50% off of your first order as well as free shipping, go ahead and use my code in the description as well as the link to make it as easy as possible. Let them know that MacroBioBoy sent you. It would really help out the channel. Thank you again to Factor for sponsoring us. Now, as far as the actual minions that we're using, since we're trying to have as many synergies as possible, the Arsonists continue to be the forefront of the majority of our damage. And I would say that they're actually even eclipsing the output of our Raging Spirits. Not that that is now somehow a bad option, but just to give an idea of how it continues to scale. Skeletal warriors from your Rattling Scepter are just going to sit there as basic meat shields. The entire purpose of them are to be able to tank a bit for us, as well as be able to grant us an option to be able to hit with our pain offering. Using instability just so that in case they do die, they give us a little bit more DPS. Last gas so they stay around longer, so even if they're dead, we can still hit them with offering. And then hit them with Elemental Army just for a little bit more survivability. Obviously, our Hellhound is one of the primary components of our build. And again, we're using them to continue to be a huge Ignite source and to be able to synergize with Ignite itself. We're going to give them Fire Pen naturally, so that's just going to further increase their damage. Fire Infusion for even more elemental damage here. Wildfire so that their Ignite spreads even further than the base radius around them. And then Fiery Death. I'm trying to figure out where Fiery Death fits into the build, either on Raging Spirits or on the Infernal Hellhound. I think that the Hellhound itself is doing less damage than the Raging Spirits themselves, so I'm trying to use Fiery Death here just to basically get the most out of our damage sources possible. Obviously, Raging Spirits continues to be an absolute powerhouse here. Infernal Legion will make it so that they continue to deal even more damage with their Ignite in a larger radius around them. Feeding Frenzy will further increase their damage. Both Infernal Legion as well as Feeding Frenzy are supposed to have these downsides of them very slowly killing themselves or taking more damage, but they never really get targeted by enemies. So unless it's a huge AoE effect that was going to kill them anyways, there's really no downside here. We're also going to use them to apply fire exposure. They immediately ignite targets around them, and since they immediately ignite, they immediately apply fire exposure. You have 100% uptime here. Arsonists are the main bang for our buck here, and what we've basically done is turned off their ability to ignite at all, but made them synergized against ignited targets. So Scattershot will continue to just grant them more projectiles, and while it does make them attack a little bit slower and do less damage, the larger amount of projectiles gains so much from Flame Wall that it's worth it. Elemental Focus will say that they can't apply ailments, meaning they can't apply Ignite themselves, but that's okay, they do more elemental damage. And then Immolate will just straight up say they can Ignite, so these two downsides are redundant, they don't do anything different here. at least not for our build in the way that we're using them. But as you can see here, you gain a huge damage multiplier against an ignited target. So both our Hellhounds and our Raging Spirits are doing that for us, and the Arsonist can just deal with doing straight up as much DPS as possible. I have enjoyed using Skeletal Cleric. It's actually become a bit of a joke here because this little skeleton guy, if you've never looked at him, is hilarious. He's walking around with his little, undead Bible here. We like to consider him our Union Priest, just looking over the rest of the skeletons that we have, making sure they're hydrated, getting their company time mandated breaks, etc. But the Skeletal Priest, just keeping them all very slightly topped off, as well as reviving them a little bit faster than you typically would, is obviously a huge overall benefit to the build. And we basically just gave them Meat Shield to make them a little bit more efficient. There's another support gem that I would like to use here, which is basically reduce the recovery rate of their cooldowns. But we need that for our only mobility skill that matters, which is Blink. I realized I didn't touch on Blink earlier. Blink is going to take your dodge roll and turn it into a teleport. And then by supporting it, you can give it an additional charge where it will happen, but it does add a cooldown to your dodge. So you'll basically need to dodge smarter in combat, but the benefit of it is actually having a mobility skill in this game, and it is definitely worth it. But you're going to want to get used to how it works so you get a better understanding of when to spam it in combat so you're not leaving yourself without a blink. The only thing to keep in mind though is that blink is a little bit finicky. So as you can see here, like if you were to hit a wall or like hit a corner or something, blink might not work. So you're definitely going to, let's just be honest here, kind of die sometimes, and it's going to feel a little bit bad. If you're playing on hardcore, get used to how blink works. But the reason why we don't currently have the Ingenuity, that cooldown recovery for our Skeleton Priests, are on Blink. Before that, I had that up here as well. Now, the only other option would be your Skeleton Storm Mage, and I think that a lot of people are generally recommending it, and it's easy to understand why. Basically, the Storm Mage, if you make it so that it has a higher chance of being able to apply ailments, as well as being able to spread ailments, will apply Shock. Shock says that the target just takes 20% more damage, which is great. It's awesome. It was very powerful against bosses where it had really good uptime. My only issue with the Storm Mage was that I found that in clearing out density, with only having one mage because of how expensive they are, 40 spirit, and I don't really have a ton of additional spirit on my build, as well as the 6 slot for my Ascension yet, I really couldn't fit it in easily. And I just generally found that clear speed against trash mobs, as well as just density throughout a map, really didn't experience the shock application here. And considering the fact that against a boss, an additional Arsonist would probably represent a greater than or at least equal to a 20% damage increase across the board, and obviously those numbers are going to change depending on how many minions you have, I didn't generally feel like the shock uptime there was worth the downside of having one less Arsonist walking around. And then the only other thing that I wanted to talk about was the passive skill tree and the decisions that I'm making here, as well as what I'm building into. Since I haven't built out everything, I'm going to go ahead and show it to you in the max roll planner just because it's a little bit more clear. But I do want to put this disclaimer up. I straight up am fairly new to this game, as well as the relative value of various survivability stats. While I functionally understand the difference between armor, evasion, and then how maximum life, energy shield, and mana as a mana shield through various options works, I don't necessarily have a great intuition to what is the best possible decisions that you could be making. But I've received a ton of really good insight as well as recommendations from my community. So when we hop into Max Roll Planner, I want to touch on what those are and what you need to understand about them. And interestingly enough, to talk about the different decisions for survivability, because the rest of it makes kind of sense, right? I basically just picked up every single node that said make my minions do more damage, etc., etc. But it's Bidet's will here, and yes, Baydats, but I'm going to call it Bidet. It's Bidet's will here that is really informing the decisions that I'm making. Basically, what this says is that the more maximum life that you have, the more spirit that you have. The more spirit you have, the more minions that you can have. But you need to get a huge amount of maximum life to be able to do that. And typically, maximum life and the ability to stack it comes from your strength. For every point of strength that you get 2 maximum life. And since we are getting a lot of strength on the build to be able to max out our maximum life to get as much spirit as possible, we should probably build into gear that works for strength. And strength pieces of gear typically revolve around armor as a survivability stat for reducing incoming physical damage. So if strength gear will give us armor, which means that we can offset damage that way, we can also benefit from things like shields. Shields just give you straight up a percentage chance to ignore all incoming damage from an attack. This is very similar to like Diablo 2. where there's a maximum cap of shield. I think you can only block 75% of the time. So if the armor will grant us physical damage reduction and then the shield can kind of help us to offset the majority of other damage, then other than that, we just need to cap our resistances, which is something that I think the majority of builds typically seek to do, with a slight understanding that altered flesh is going to make it so that fire and cold damage isn't as big of a concern as fire resistance, since we're going to convert some of that to fire damage. And then the only other thing that we need to understand is that some of the incoming physical damage that we would have been reducing is instead going to be chaos damage. So we need to find ways to be able to increase our chaos resistance as well, just to be able to offset that a little bit. Okay, great. Now let's look at the rest of the passive tree. You'll notice that we picked up the majority of the primary minion nodes that are going to increase our minions' damage. While there are other ones that we didn't take, they're typically going to grant them elemental resistances or other more niche or minute stats that I don't think are as powerful. Thank you to the comments in my most recent video, understanding that attempting to stack minion critical strike chance is just not really something that can be done in the game currently. We're not going to be investing in that at all. But the two main things that people were continuously chirping at me about were the idea of Eldritch Battery as well as Mind Over Matter. And I just want to very quickly touch on these in case you're brand new to PoE and you haven't had to deal with conversion type effects in this game before. Eldritch Battery will convert your energy shield into mana. And what that means is that it will take the base value, so not anything that grants you like percentage increased energy shield, like something you might find in your passive tree. It takes the base amount that you have from your gear and instead adds that to your mana. Since it converts it, it no longer scales with the original one. So anything that scaled your energy shield before will stop, and anything that scales your mana will now work for it. So if I were to have a piece of gear that naturally has energy shield on it, and then it were to gain percentage energy shield, that actually modifies how much energy shield is on the item. It effectively just increases the integer value. So you don't consider this as scaling your energy shield. You would just take this 105 energy shield and turn it into mana, as opposed to something like your amulet, which grants you a global modifier of your energy shield because the item itself does not grant it as an integer value. So what this means is that this 50% increased maximum energy shield would not increase the amount of mana that you gain from Eldritch Battery. And there are two reasons why this is really important. One, energy shield takes double damage from your chaos damage sources. So energy shield is less efficient against a thing that we're going to be taking more damage from naturally. And converting it into mana means that that is no longer a concern. But you might also say, well, it also means I don't have energy shield, which is correct. And that's why people also use Mind Over Matter. Mind Over Matter will apply damage to your mana before it applies to your life. So the way it normally works is it would hit your energy shield, then it would hit your life, and then you would die if you kept taking damage. Since this will take all of your damage from your mana, it will instead look to apply the damage to your mana first. And since all of your energy shield is now mana, after it would get through your mana, even if it did exist, you don't get this downside of the energy shield being half effective against chaos damage. Very similar to energy shield from Diablo 2, if you're used to using something like that. Well, that one was a bit of a rambling mess. That is the approach that I'm taking to my passive skill tree, how I'm personally building into survivability. So it's this general idea of stacking armor, relying on block, getting res capped, trying to focus on chaos res in particular, as well as fire res, and then managing our additional survivability through our mana shield, through a huge mana battery, and offsetting the downsides that energy shield typically is negatively impacted by. And there you have the Endgame Infernalist Minion Witch. I'm having a ton of fun with this build. I'm excited to see how it continues to develop and whether or not my gut reaction to how survivability is supposed to work in this game is going to work out for it. If you're brand new here and you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it helped you to better enjoy the game as it currently stands and to survive the various nerfs that are coming through early access. Very happy to report that none of the nerfs that have hit thus far have actually impacted this build's output. I wasn't really using Cast on Ignite, and we were never really auto-triggering Raging Spirits, so this thing has just continued to truck on. Leave a comment down below if you have any new ideas, concepts, concerns, insights, can share any cool strategies with me. I've really enjoyed the ability to be educated by the masses here, just the people who have a lot more experience in this game who have been really willing to share it with me. Again, thank you all so much. It has helped me out a ton. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.